Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Van Schie, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joel Mitchell. How are they, Joel?
I am tired of heat waves, Jason. They have been incessant this summer. I actually went and looked through the daily temperature records from December through until now, and it was close to 30 days in excess of 37 degrees in the last 3 months.
Yeah, no, it's been really hot. I think we've had like one day where it rained a little bit as well in that 2-month period.
Yeah.
So I was having a bit of a hay fever attack yesterday, and I was speaking to someone over Teams. Like, it's February, it's not spring. I'm like, yeah, but it's so dry.
Yeah. And there was that storm as well that came through. So that always blows up all the pollen and stuff. And
yeah. So, it's been ridiculously hot while our friends in the Northern Hemisphere are having very cold temperatures. We're definitely feeling global warming here in Perth.
Yeah. And we've still got March to come as well, which in Perth tends to be the hottest month of the year. So yay.
At least our aircon kind of works.
It does, yeah. It's labouring a little bit today, and we've still got a few days to go before it drops down a bit as well. So yeah.
Yeah. All right. So to those watching on the video, if we start sweating, it's probably because of the heat and lack of aircon.
Yes, I can't imagine any other reason.
No.
No.
All right. Well, look, let's introduce our guest then, shall we?
Yes.
Okay. So this guest joined the New South Wales Police at the age of 19 and later switched to become a firefighter. After 11 years service, he moved to Pastoral Ministry for 20 years. Over the last 10 years, he's also served as an ambulance chaplain with his therapy dog, Wallace. He currently is conducting doctoral research at Charles Sturt University in partnership with the New South Wales Centre for Workplace Health and Safety around trauma and moral injury in first responders. Welcome to the podcast, Mark Layson.
Yeah, hi Jason, hi Joel. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, now I got to say, I think this is the first time we've had a chaplain on the show. Most of our listeners probably don't realise this, but I'm a PK myself, so my dad's a minister of religion. So going to be a really interesting conversation, I think, today.
Hopefully there'll be lots more chaplains in the future. It's an interesting space to be in chaplaincy. It's been around for such a long time, but the level of research in it isn't fantastic. So doing a bit around that as well.
Yeah, and look, we've featured, occupational health nurses, org psychs, obviously quite a bit, health and safety professionals. So good to get another discipline who is contributing to psychological health and safety.
Yeah, it's a really interesting take on the wellbeing space. They're much more relational. That's the whole pastoral thing, is the relationship building and building of trust and walking alongside people as they go through stuff.
Yeah, well, looking forward to exploring that with you today.
Yeah.
So before we get started, what podcasts do you enjoy?
I really like revisionist history. So there's an episode in particular that I keep playing to everyone, Descend into the Particular. And it's a really interesting take on police shootings. So that's it's an episode that I keep going back to. He's really good at that. One of their sort of spin-offs as well, Against the Rules, Michael Lewis. It's really fascinating. It links into my work here, is about the removal or the descent of respect and authority for the referees in life, whether that be the person who referees the basketball game or decides whether or not an art work is real or fake, or whether it's about the person who decides what's appropriate grammar and the way to pronounce particular words and spell them, and why in modern society the referee is less and less considered valuable. That's really interesting. Another one which was really disturbing but really important was a short one on, it was called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, about a church in the United States where lots of this psychological health and safety stuff was just let to run rampant. And it's a real cautionary tale on how systems, even in supposedly the best meaning situations can absolutely fall terribly. And it was disturbing, but really important.
Good. Some useful listening there for our listeners.
The rise and fall of Mars Hill has been on my to listen to list for a while, so I might use this as an incentive to start listening to it.
I hadn't heard of it before, but
had a few people recommend that to me.
So, Mark, can you tell us about your professional career, please?
Yeah, and Jason said a little bit. I was a young, naive, middle-class white boy who joined the police at the age of 19, and my eyes bugged open very quickly about what the rest of the world looked like. Then I joined Fire Brigade and fought fires for a living, which was a fantastic job. Pastoral Ministry, I was a pastor of a church for a couple of different churches for 20 years, which means really just getting involved in people's lives and actually trying to walk alongside them and help them and encourage them in life and in their faith and in their spirituality and those kinds of things. So really being involved with people there, and then doing this ambulance chaplaincy. I sit on an ethics board for doing the pastoral role. So human research and ethics committees have a pastoral person on board. So I sit on doing that, and done some chaplaincy in aged care as well. But yeah, now into doing my research.
Fantastic. And I can't continue this conversation until you tell us a little bit about your work with Wallace.
Yeah, Wallace is my 4-year-old Labrador dog. He comes along with me in the ambulance service, and I was saying to Joelle before, it's fantastic. I walk into a room now with Wallace and everyone goes, "Hello, beautiful." And it's great for my ego until I realise it's actually about the dog. But he comes along with me. He begs for food, as good as he's a Labrador. He gets lots of pats, and he's a great conversation starter with people for me to be able to build a conversation and relationship and trust. And also you see the paramedics just having a bit of a rumble with him and just taking the heat out. And so many times people will say to me, "Oh, this is the best thing that's happened to me all day." And he knows at certain places people keep treats for him. So sometimes he'll take off because he knows where the treats are. I know exactly where to find him because he's with the treats. But he really takes the temperature down, gives people a bit of a psychological break for one, and also help build relationships. So he's fantastic to work with.
See, I told you having a dog in our app would be a good thing.
I agreed with you.
Yeah, I know. No, so funny story, Mark, talking about Labradors. We thought it'd be funny because we have a chat bot that teaches people about positive psychology skills in our app. And people can choose the avatar, right? So have a range of sexes, ethnicities, and that sort of thing. And we thought it'd be funny if we had like a dog in there, and we're like, oh, if we've got a dog, I guess we've got to have a cat in there too to keep the cat people happy. But our graphic designer chose this really beautiful Labrador as the chat avatar, and so maybe we should call it Wallace when people choose the Labrador. That would be pretty cool.
If Mark agrees to allow us to,
he might have to review the platform first. Yeah. But so funny. Like it's about breaking down barriers, right? And if a dog's the way to do it, then that's great.
Yeah, and I do have this hunch as well. You know, dogs are known for their loyalty, and as I think along these moral injury and betrayal things that we'll talk about, there's something to be said about a dog's loyalty, I think, as well. You know where you stand quite often.
Yeah, that's right. If someone's got better snacks than you, then they lose their loyalty pretty quickly, don't they? So, but at least they're predictable. So
they are. I've not heard of many dogs who become backstabbers. So
yeah. So look, onto your research then, Mark, because that's consuming a lot of your life at the moment, no doubt. So you're doing your PhD at Charles Sturt University. Can you share your area of research that you're focusing in on?
Yeah, look, it started with the concept of moral injury, which sits around the world of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. It's a different way of looking at that. As I've been digging, there's actually lots of different models that talk about this moral aspect of what's going on with trauma exposure and organisational stresses and those things, different things called moral distress and perceived injustice, or even just a great one, being screwed by the organisation. and everyone kind of gets it when you talk about that. So I'm really interested in looking at the way that the moral, relational, and spiritual context involves with our trauma exposure and distress that arises from it. That's one of the things about moral injury as well. It's saying there's something deeper than just the cognitive processes that are going on when you feel betrayed, when the things you feel and believe about the way the world should be, the person that you think you are, when you think perhaps I've compromised myself and I've acted against my moral code. And I don't know if I can express what my moral code is, but it's something deep down hurts. And what that looks like to explore. So a holistic response to that, a psychosocial, spiritual model is what I'm trying to build that takes account of all the stuff that we know and incorporate this more existential, spiritual and religious factor.
Yeah, I find it a really fascinating area, right? Because we've had people come on and talk about vicarious trauma, PTSD, that sort of thing. But moral injury is different again, right? So how does moral injury relate to responses to trauma?
Yeah, it's really important. First of all, they're not mutually exclusive. They certainly overlap. The point of those overlap is not 100% certain in people's minds yet, and we're still just trying to work that out. It's a pretty new field of study, but saying that they're not mutually exclusive is really important, and they do affect each other, trauma exposure in the way that we understand PTSD and those other reactions as well. But it's unlike PTSD particularly in a few different ways. One of the things with trauma, and particularly if there's a diagnosis of PTSD, there has to be an objective criterion, a traumatic event that you witnessed, or a death, or a physical violence, or sexual assault, or being a victim of it. And that's much more objective. When we're talking about moral injury, there is an element of the more subjective and personal and deeper element of it. So we talk about potentially morally injurious events. We both attend a motor vehicle accident where someone is killed. We've objectively been exposed to trauma. But the things that we take away from that, whether or not they've crossed my moral code or yours, or the things that I feel that I've done that weren't according to my code, they can be quite different. So there's a bit more of the subjective element to it. And so PTSD requires that traumatic event before it's a kind of a gateway into the other parts of a diagnosis, where moral injury, it requires some sense of betrayal or self-compromise rather than trauma per se. I think what is really interesting is the interplay between that trauma and the betrayal is where the really interesting space is. But PTSD is more about that fear and danger response as well. It triggers that hypervigilance. So you're ready on response. I know I had someone I was caring for in one particular situation, and had trauma in his childhood. And he didn't like me because I'm a tall male, I'm 6'5", and he took an instant dislike to me. He saw me and said, "I'm never going to talk to you." And eventually, actually with Wallace, we broke down some barriers, and he sort of apologized to me and said, "Look, I hope you can understand where I'm coming from." Okay, yeah, I can. And, I want you to take it at your pace, talk to him. The next day, he had a very minor accident, and his entire trauma response was there. He was swearing, he was threatening people, he was just from the tiniest amount, he completely triggered. So that danger and fear response is hardwired, whereas moral injury, it's more about guilt and shame, and also about outrage as well, when you feel you've been done an injustice by other people. So in some ways, people with PTSD, the world is not safe. For moral injury, the world is not fair. Mm-hmm. PTSD is very much about the present and the future, the danger. I don't know if you've ever gone to lunch with a police officer or an ex-police officer. Have a look where they sit, because they always want to be able to see the door and the exit route. And I know I still do all these years later. So it's very much in the present and bringing that to, whereas moral injury is very much ruminating on the past and looking in what's gone on in the past, and regret, remorse, feelings of vengeance, and anger that won't let go. And the final one that I sort of alluded to before was PTSD is very seen much more in a biological and psychological cognitive response to that, whereas moral injury is digging a little bit deeper into the human psyche and saying, well, what are the relational, the existential, the spiritual elements of what's going on here in the way that your worldview, your just world beliefs have been violated. So it's going probably a little bit deeper into the person. So there's some of the nuances of what's going on in the moral injury space.
Yeah, well, how you say it, like PTSD is about saying that the world isn't safe, whereas moral injury is about feeling it's not fair. I think that's probably really the big difference, right?
Yeah. It really is, and that taps into us, I think, on such a different level, because the way I think the world works and you are perhaps a little bit different, but once our worldview is assaulted, that's that talking about that spirituality element, which I think is one of the most compelling elements of moral injury, but also one of the more difficult ones to actually talk about for a lot of people because of past experiences, either with an idea of spirituality or with religiosity or whatever it might be. So it's really important, but really difficult and talked about in many ways.
Yeah, you gave the example before of, attending a car crash where there's been a fatality. That's obviously an objective form of trauma. And everyone would understand that for some people that might lead to PTSD, particularly repeated exposure to that sort of trauma. Could you give us maybe a practical example about a type of trauma or an event that could lead to someone experiencing a moral injury?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that particularly has been coming up in my research is I've been going under this code for vulnerable people. So if you're an emergency service worker, you're quite used to people to death and dying. And if you go to, say, a 55-year-old morbidly obese male who has a heart attack, you'll go and you'll try and you'll do your best, but in the end you go, okay, well, too bad, so sad. That kind of happens. You go to a 2 or 3-year-old child who has the same medical outcome, has a heart attack of one kind, either from a traumatic thing or a medical thing, and all of a sudden the lid is blown off because we have this set that this shouldn't happen to 2 and 3-year-olds. A child shouldn't be in this situation. And then you have, I call them real world hooks. Quite often we can put trauma away from us to deal with the situation. We can put the pathos away, but when the real world comes in, when the child is the same age as your child, or the granny who's died has got the same name as your granny, it's the sight of a smell, and all of a sudden everything from your real life comes and invades that particular space. And then it starts to bring up all those things about, is the world a fair place? This isn't the way it should be. It's just not right. And so that class of vulnerable people is one of those particular event-based things that can really trigger that sense of betrayal, but also just moral compromise. And then if you didn't perform well or as well as you'd want to, ruminating, if only I'd done this, if only I'd done that, it can be really quite difficult on your psyche to be able to put that together with a vulnerable person, because it shouldn't be this way.
Yeah, and I can see how the media could actually cause moral injury at scale, right? If they're presenting things to us where, like, we just don't feel it's fair. I remember, just recently here in WA with little Cleo who went missing, and that had such an effect on the whole of Western Australia, if not broader than that.
Yeah.
And then that amazing sense of relief when she was returned to her family, and this sense of justice that was done, and that kind of moral injury was kind of addressed. It was very palatable at the time.
I actually remember reading the news headline that she'd been found, and I started crying. It was intense. Yeah. And in that sense, I hear you say, I think that's fantastic. You've actually understood the pathos of the moment, and it I sometimes say to paramedics, tears are the proof that the human is kind of leaking out of you, because we so often there's
there's some people who find it hard to show emotion, but when you force a shutting down of emotion on people, that can have really difficult consequences. And emotion suppressed is really an emotion just delayed. Yeah.
I mean, it's, I think that this concept of moral injury, particularly during the pandemic, has been very relevant, thinking about stories of healthcare, workers in hospitals needing to decide who's going to be put on a ventilator because they just don't have enough for the people who need them, and essentially deciding who's going to live and who's going to die. And you think about the calling that people have when they go into healthcare and the purpose of that profession, and then, being forced to make those decisions. I would imagine that, we've got a growing body of people experiencing moral injury through those types of scenarios where they have had to make those unconscionable decisions. That rationing of ventilators in particular, I know there's some really disturbing stuff came out of Italy really early on, when it was just this idea that you normally decide the use of treatment on the viability of the patient, but not on the amount of resources you've got. But it's also those other elements that sit in there as well, where someone is dying and you're denying their loved one to come and sit with them. And that has really grated on healthcare workers as well. And I know, working in aged care, seeing the emotional cost on the elderly residents there when they can't see their people, and you just feel terrible. They're touching through a glass or something like that. And then, of course, I think I don't know what side everyone sits on the vaccination debate, but when you're having to treat someone who's not been vaccinated and you've been vaccinated, and now you're putting yourself at risk because they've got an increased risk of infection and serious infection, and not going, I'm going to treat you, I don't know if I want to, but that real dissonance between what's right and what's wrong and your decision. Yes, you're free to make that decision, but I bear the responsibility and also the danger as a response of that. And so that it's really quite complex. And then, it sits around the provision of equipment, right very early on, provision of PPE, personal protective equipment, and that kind of stuff. When that's not there, and the workload, that's the excessive workload that's gone on top of it, so it becomes layers on top of layers on top of layers, on top of exhaustion and all physical exhaustion as well. So it's the research on moral injury has just exploded over the last couple of years. It's been really interesting to see.
Yeah, no, fascinating.
So you've spent the majority of your career either working as a first responder or working with first responders. We've had in a very early podcast, Carlo Caponecchia said that many of the psychosocial issues for first responders that actually create distress for them are not all that different to the things that create distress for other types of workers. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, look, I think I really agree with that. I did go back and listen to Carlo because I know some of his work, and I think the way he set up the difference between context and content. Part of the reason I got into doing moral injury stuff is I'm sitting alongside these paramedics who have had these experiences and thinking, actually, what you're saying is not that much different to what other people have. It's just in starker relief. And so a lot of that, and I'll talk about it in a little while, a lot of the things that they feel and that really grate on them are not that dissimilar to what would be psychosocial risks in other workplaces as well. It's just that trauma seems to up the ante quite considerably. And that's perhaps it's not just the context or the content, it's the interplay between those particular things that are really, really important. Those organisational context things, the way you're treated by an organisation. One of the people, I try and work with, I risked my life and this is the way they treat me. It shows you a little bit of that interplay between them. It ups your expectation. It ups the requirement for loyalty, I think. There's some really interesting research on the way soldiers react to each other after the heat of battle. And there's quite a strong love bond that formulates between them. And quite often that bond is even stronger than they have with their spouse. It's not a sexual relationship. It's stronger than that. It's forged in the heat of battle. And I think, and I see it in the first responders I've been speaking with in my research as well, this love bond. You've been to these particular events and you have a heightened need for and sense of relationship, and it's really relationship that builds the possibility for betrayal. It's always a two-edged sword relationship. The stronger your relationship, the more you open yourself up to hurt from it as well.
So, I mean, for this group of workers, what would you say are some of the more significant psychosocial risks then in that context?
Yeah, look, I think trauma does fit into it, and it's one of the elements of psychological risk. And I think I've been looking more into the New South Wales Code of Practice in particular, but that trauma exposure is part of it. For first responders, you also get shift work, and shift work does a number of different things. It really affects your sleep. And, if you're not sleeping well, you're not being well. And that's one of the first questions I'll ask people, how are you sleeping? Because that has we all know has such a large impact. So that in itself becomes a risk. And then because of shift work as well, diet. I remember we used to work 7 night shifts straight when I was first in the police, and we'd knock off at 7 a.m. on a Thursday morning. We'd all go to the pub for a beer. Beer and bacon and egg rolls at 7 a.m. in the morning, but that's what your body was saying was cool. And watch the city go to work as you have a strange meal and waking up not knowing what meal to eat, and just grabbing stuff in between or starting your meal and then a call comes. So, you miss out on that. You miss out on exercise just because you're so dog tired. And so all those physical elements. And you've got the organisational stresses. And I think this is the sense of betrayal and organisational justice and those things. This is really super important that we perhaps have missed in the first responder context, because trauma is so kind of like sexy. It's just there in your face and you can see it. And well, trauma's there, so there's a causal link between trauma exposure, but the betrayal sense becomes, I think, the thing that is working with trauma exposure, but we miss it. And so those little things like, say, the lack of recognition or reward for what you do, that can be one of those things that can be a real risk factor for people. And that was a real surprise in the research I was doing about awarding a medal. I don't know, do you want to go down that little rabbit hole a little bit, or?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke about this when scoping out this podcast, this whole idea of reward and recognition. It's an interesting one.
I'm just like, I'm sort of seeing a lot of ties there with, the concept of psychological contract, I think. And when you're talking about organizational betrayal, that's sort of what that makes me think of, is that psychological contract where, you're going to these great lengths for this organization and you expect a certain response or a certain type of treatment from that employer as, appropriate compensation, not necessarily financial, but other types of compensation. And when it fails to manifest, then you do feel that sense of betrayal that, well, where's the balance? Where's the fairness there?
And sometimes I think you're so right. It's that unwritten contract that is the one that is the most hurtful when it gets broken. If I work really hard in this job, if I do this, then I'll get my transfer or I'll get my promotion. And you work really hard and then someone else gets the transfer. And you go, but hang on, that's not what I was expecting. And the organisation doesn't see it or know it. So there's both. We've got to delve the subjective element of it, but also understand the objective things, like that Michael Lewis against the rules. So what is an independent arbiter got to say about this, and how do we balance those? How do we help an organisation to be sensitive? How do we help an individual to understand that context as well? And that communication piece is super important. But I mean, the medal ones is really interesting because the way, as paramilitary organisations, your police and fire and ambulance, they'll get medals for particular things. And I was struck. I was at a really serious, very famous incident afterwards in Sydney, and I was speaking to one of the people there, and I said, "Oh, this must have been really significant for you tonight." I went, "No, not really." He said, "Last week when I was on the top of a cliff with 5 really seriously injured people in a car, and it was unstable, and it was really clinically difficult." He said, that was a bad one. And so we tend to recognise the things that make the news and not the things that happen behind the scenes. Or, and another person talking about they were involved in one of the major bushfire disasters that happened over the last few years. And they worked for 12 days straight, and they recovered bodies, from bushfire, burnt houses. So it's not a nice job. 13 bodies they recovered in those days. And then they decided who they're going to give medals to. And they said, well, people who have served for 14 days in a row will get a medal. So he missed out. Now, not that he was doing it for the medal, but then there's something that really grates you about, I've done this work, but the guy sitting in the air-conditioned office doing rosters, which is really important, gets a medal. There's something that's not right here. And people feel sometimes quite a deal of shame, but they're being publicly recognised for the most terrifying day of their life. And we give medals, as one participant said, we give medals not for the person who receives them, but for the person who's putting it on their chest, to make them feel good about recognising you. And I think medals are really important and great. Perhaps we can look at the way in which we do that better. Yeah,
it's something that we've spoken about a number of times, I think, on the podcast. When you bring in a control, like, say, a reward and recognition program, then you have to be aware that you might be bringing in another hazard. And so what you're saying is that there's this sense of unfairness when that is brought in poorly or incorrectly, which can then lead to a moral injury, perhaps.
Yeah.
And I think that an interesting element there is the performative nature of the way that those medals are distributed as well, that there's potentially an element of, public interest associated with that decision-making process, which I could see would lead to feelings of cynicism in the members of the workforce who are or are not recipients of those medals because of that performative nature of how they're assigned, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and quite often on arbitrary criteria, arbitrary performance criteria, like that, how many days until you've served until you've got the particular medal. And also when it sits in, you might be being investigated for the matter for which you're getting a medal. You hear people, they're investigating. It was a really serious incident, a first of its kind. It's really deep in terms of its clinical importance. You never actually get to have your say clinically. And then they say, oh, you did such a good, let's give you a medal. But they've never actually asked you what happened and gone on third-party reports, and don't allow, it's not a person-centered model where you go, you tell us and we want to reward you what's according. It comes from an outside element on arbitrary elements, or when the event occurred and you didn't have the equipment, and some people will go, look, we would have preferred to actually have equipment, the right bulletproof vests rather than condemned ones for this particular incident. We would have preferred that. And it can be quite tokenistic, or other people saying, I've got my long service and good conduct medal in the internal post. It was sitting in my locker when I got there. Thank you very much. I just would have been nice to have some recognition to go, job well done. And that may have even covered it for me. And it can be used sometimes as a proxy for actually properly recognising and being thankful. And that's perhaps an organisational setting. It's worth talking about that idea of thankfulness rather than just recognition.
Yeah. Given the source of a moral injury is not as clear cut as, say, with something like PTSD, you can be quite objective, as you said earlier, about is that a trauma that they're exposed to or not. Yeah. Is there anything we can do systemically to prevent the development of a moral injury?
Yeah, look, I think there is. I think one of the things that's possibly good about moral injury compared to PTSD is trauma exposure is written into the job description of police, fire, ambulance, and emergency medical people. Now, that's what your job actually is, but betrayal isn't. There's nowhere in the contract your organisation is going to betray you and backstab you. and treat you poorly. And so it is a risk that we can mitigate, I think. And so what I'm really trying to do in mine is the idea of betrayal is quite amorphous, really. It's betrayal, what does that even mean? So I'm trying to find particular trigger events that are common for particular people and be able to, okay, well, how can we then organisationally try and change those? And I think you can actually do some great organisational change. And perhaps the difficult thing with it is it's not just changing, putting in an app or giving some cupcakes. It's actually deep cultural change in the C-suite of organisations, and the way that they think about things and the way that they look, particularly in the management structure. And if I was to go, the first place I was to go, it would be the way in which we help our managers be leaders, and to be people who understand people and build a much more relational model. Yes, with authority in those particular situations, but authority to be in a relationship that lifts up rather than pushes down. And so, yeah, there are some particular things. And I think when you look at the things that can cause that, like as you look at what the things that people are saying are causing them distress, I could go to a particular thing that causes distress. Charles Sturt University did some research. Russell Robertson and his team did some research about what was causing distress in first responders during COVID. Now, you might think that, watching people drown in their own bodily fluids and being able to prevent people from seeing their dying relatives might be top of the list. Not according to this. The top 5 things were the extra workload that they had, just the rapidly changing work environment, but then there was the insufficient practical support, the things that they needed on the ground, and lack of management connection was the 4th one, with what's actually going on right at the coalface, not just barking orders from further beyond. And the last one was just the not getting ambiguous, conflicting, and redundant communication. So these are the things, and you look at those and you can fit them pretty neatly into a lot of different psychosocial risk categories. And so I think a number of those can be addressed by practices. And so they come out in workload, they come out in trauma exposure. But if I was to go anywhere, first of all, it's to try and help those leaders right in the middle who are actually the really coalface element of the organisational, and quite often are the meat in the sandwich. I think in lots of organisations, there's that pivot point from being in the field to being in the organisational structure. For police, it's the sergeant and the inspector. For ambulance, it's the duty operations manager who are enforcing policy on people here. So they're still on the ground, they're out on the field, but they're doing that kind of stuff. And that group of people, that's where I think we can achieve lots in this space and remove some of that. That's where the data seems to be pointing us, and my own experience and what my research participants are saying to me as well.
Yeah, and that definitely just is very, how would you say, it backs up what we've been saying for a while, that hazards can be very different from group to group. And a lot of that is decided upon based on the leader of that group, the line manager, really. And so really you can't do psych health and safety in an organization without equipping line managers on, first of all, understanding what psych hazards are, but then what they can be doing to protect people against these psych hazards by focusing on work design, as you say, because it's not the exposure to trauma necessarily that's the issue. It's the good old things of role conflict and management support and workload and all that sort of stuff.
Oh, absolutely. I had people from one organisation, when I was initially talking about my research, just tell us the right kind of person to recruit so they're not at a risk of getting this. And I said, well, you've actually got to work out whether or not you're an organisation who's worthy to recruit someone, because it's a two-way street here. And I think I'm going to go back to them and go, actually, what about the right person to promote? Those settings that we have for promotion, when they're based on the performance of actually doing that job, it's not a good criteria to put you in leadership. Leadership is a different kind of role. Clinical, you need enough respect from people to be a leader of them. You can't be clinically terrible, say in an ambulance setting, and expect to have the respect of the truth. But you don't have to be the best clinical operator to be a good leader. It's that not all the top world champion soccer players or football players make good coaches. It's a different set of criteria, and that interpersonal stuff. I think a question should be, what's your modus operandi for reconciling interpersonal relationships, and when is a time that you've done it in the workplace? Reconciling relationships is such an important element on this, and that involves all the good communication skills. And so it's selecting, recruiting, and then I think ongoing mentoring. And imagine if all the money we spent on cupcakes we put on mentoring our leaders and enabling them to do that. It would be money better spent, I think.
Yeah, and what you're talking about is something that's not just unique to first responders, leaders getting promoted based on technical competence rather than actual leadership competence. Yeah. But I think there's examples of that in probably every industry. Education is a really good example, right? You get teachers who've been a teacher for 20 years and then all of a sudden they're responsible for a $15, $20 million budget, 2,000 students, all of the stakeholder relationships. It's a very different job to being a teacher, but we recruit based on, experience being a teacher and educator. So yeah, I totally agree. Finding the right people with the right attributes, not expecting them to have it from the outset either. So ongoing training and mentoring is so important in those roles.
Yeah. That idea of, I know there's been some research in this space about, the dark personality traits, can be quite prevalent in leaders, and they can be quite good at actually getting that place. A narcissist can be very good at putting themselves forward for promotion, but they don't necessarily make a good thing. And yeah, you end up with that, the classic old Peter principle. And I think sometimes there's an emotional intelligence Peter principle that goes on as well. We tend to have less emotional intelligence sometimes in a leadership thing because we've promoted them on their technical skills and not their interpersonal skills. And they can gravitate towards the top of an organisation. So yeah, look, I think that is really important. And that filters into other things like your organisational justice settings. The way in which we try and deal with when we do the wrong thing, or we stray from the particular codes of practice that we need in our work, our clinical interventions as an ambulance officer or our ethical code as police. What do we do when people breach that? And if you've got people who are trying to find a technical solution to that, trying to find, okay, what's the bullet point in the code of ethics that was broken and by whom, and how do we punish them? And this is this Sidney Dekker idea of, larger organisational justice settings going on. Because quite often when you put it into that trauma setting and you feel you've done the wrong thing and it's led possibly to the death of someone or a serious injury or wrongful imprisonment, how do you then deal with a person? Because unless you say, well, look, they came in with malicious intent to do the wrong thing, for some reason they thought it was the right thing to do. Within our culture, someone thought that the wrong thing was the right thing to do in that particular situation. And when you've got people who are very much focused on a technical solution, that can be difficult.
Yeah, and then you've got all of that issue of, the arbitrariness of a right or a wrong decision when it's out of context. But when you're, taking into account all of those different situational factors and the different trade-offs that are involved in coming to that decision, that might be, the best of a worst, the best of a bad bunch of options available to you. But then when it's viewed dispassionately and outside of that context, the way that is then evaluated can be seen as incredibly unfair.
Yeah. And look, I think Sidney Dekker tells a very poignant story at the start of his book, Second Victim. He talks about a nurse with a 20 years unblemished record and she works a double shift because they're short-staffed. And then they say, can you come back the next morning? So she goes home and gets 6 hours sleep, comes home, comes back fatigued. And then they had a procedure at this particular hospital where the nurses do the first doses of medication before the doctors come in, on the paediatricians come in, because they can, get an extra 9 holes of golf in before so the nurses start up. But unfortunately, 2 different doses can be used in the same thing. They sit right near each other within the wrong dose is given and the child dies. There you've got your first victim, that the child and their family as they suffer this. But then this nurse is now, tells the story, is immediately stood down and deregistered and then sacked, and then an incredibly onerous set of conditions put back on them to get back in. And she suicides. There's got to be some kind of better way to actually, rather than just hang it around the noose, the noose around the person who's lowest in the food chain, that we can actually get away with and actually deal with those particular things and start treating things as much more systemic rather than going to those things. And there are deliberately malicious things that go on within organisations, and we need to deal with that. But it doesn't make it a safer place to have your organisational justice setting being a retributive setting where we're going to put it on file. And I'm seeing some really good work in that space. The unit I'm at do that quite well, actually. They try and do a systems thinking thing in a really, in that crossover between aeronautical and medical, and going, this is really high risk in lots of different ways. And the best way to deal with it is to take a bigger picture than just find out the person who breached the one bullet point.
Yeah, and that's really where that whole sort of piece of work on ergonomics and human factors interacts then with that organisational justice as well, and has such an important role to play there.
Yeah, and it cascades down as well, because once you feel you've been unfairly treated, you are much more likely to go into more deviant workplace behaviours and go, well, why should I do this?
Yeah, and the undermining and all of that goes on then as well. Yeah.
And that's one of the things of moral injury, is it really tries to look at character and behaviour and how it spirals down. And when you see in a worker who goes, why would I wear my protective equipment? Sometimes it sits further back up because things that they feel there's been injustice. Why do I have to play my part anymore? And that's not to excuse not wearing the right equipment, but it can certainly help you understand it, address it a bit further up the line. And, I wonder how many of the malpractice and, poor behaviour and either corrupt behaviour, it comes down to a sense of entitlement because, well, they screwed me over. Why should I do the right thing down the road? So, it really does cascade. And then you're in much more serious trouble once you've done something like that.
Yeah, or the alternative is you get that malicious compliance aspect where they're literally working to rule regardless of context.
Yeah. And that really does breach the, I think grace-based behaviours are the things that really help you to be able to do it. And what I'm big on in speaking to people is actually understanding your moral code. If you talk about my moral code as being broken, I mean, how many of us really genuinely sit down and go, this is what I believe about the world, my place in it, my purpose, my identity, why I want to do my job, the kind of person I am on my best day. We don't do that. And I do that with some people now. And I say, well, why don't you work that out? And I ask, well, how much would you be willing to sell that for? And, I don't know if you can put a price on who you are and your soul and what you believe about the world. But so often what we do is we end up not selling it, but giving it away to the person that we hate. We go, well, I'm going to compromise my own moral framework because you've done me over. Rather than go, let me revisit that. Let me draw back on that and be able to work out how I can keep who I am and not go down that road. Because I think also suffering and those things can be great points of growth. And that idea of post-traumatic growth is really, really important for us to think about. Because I hate the idea that you've been exposed to trauma or betrayal and, well, then you're stuffed for the rest of your life. There's possibilities to grow from this as well, but it takes work. It takes deliberateness. Is deliberateness a word?
It can be a word.
Being deliberate.
I came up with a word yesterday that was very similar, actually.
Yeah, you came up with a couple of words.
Directness.
Well, directness is a word.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
It's the context.
Sorry,
mate. Yeah, no, but it's actually probably a good segue there, Mark, because you mentioned earlier before that spirituality is both the most compelling and most difficult thing to talk about. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, look, I think spirituality, not just in the Western world, but all around, have a grounding historically in different religions. You look back in Australia in 1921 and 96% of people identified as Christian. There was 0.35% of people said they had no religion. And it was really quite associated with that. Spirituality, just because it was associated with it, doesn't mean it's the same thing as religiosity. And I think we can quite often put the two in the same basket and see this is a division that we don't want to go into in our workplace. Lots of people, I say with such a heavy heart, have got such a bad experience with different religions because, what we've seen over the last few years and the things that have been revealed, and say with great sorrow that churches and Christian organisations have really bruised and bent people out of shape. And people don't want anything to do with it. And so it can be really difficult because it can automatically go spiritual, religious, I don't want anything to do with it. Or it can be that sort of far out kind of thing, or that not quite esoteric, but that element of, if I get my $250 Lorna Jane pants and roll out my yoga mat and get a decaf chai latte and I've done my spirituality for the day. It can be quite specious in many kind of ways. But
Mark, funny story on that. We were working with a client over in the United States, and they saw that spirituality was one of the character strength dimensions measured by the VIA character strength survey, which we've got integrated into our platform. They're like, no, we can't ask questions on religion. I'm like, no, this is about spirituality. And they're like, no, but it's the same thing. I'm like, no, it's not. As you're saying, spirituality is more around meaning and purpose and your core values and that sort of thing, whereas religion is different. So maybe you can articulate it a bit better for me. What do you see as being the core difference between spirituality and religion?
Religiosity is much more codified and nameable. You fit into the Christian religion or the Buddhist religion, and you have certain practices that you do and certain doctrinal beliefs that you've got to ascribe to that particular thing. Spirituality, I'll use probably the only actual definition that I'm going to use today because I was thinking about this. Within the aged care sector and palliative care, this is really important because when you're dealing with end-of-life issues, this is really, really important. People start to question life. But they came out with a consensus definition a few years ago, and it's got three kind of particular elements, but it says spirituality, I'm reading this one now, is a dynamic and intrinsic aspect of humanity through which persons seek ultimate meaning, purpose, and transcendence. So that idea of seeking something bigger than themselves. They experience it, the second element of it, in their relationship to themselves, to their family, to others, to the community, to nature, to the significant, the sacred. And then it's expressed through your beliefs and values and your traditions and your practices. So, some people might find, going camping in the wilderness for a couple of days, that is something where they connect with something bigger than themselves, and it helps them reorient themselves and center themselves. That's a form of spirituality.
Going to the footy. It's nothing that Joel would never do that, but people see that as a religion, right? Because like you say, it's they're contributing something bigger than themselves as a team and a club, and then people are experiencing it, and they're getting their beer and their meat pie at halftime, and it's part of the experience, the spiritual experience.
I feel like you're really.
There's some religion elements to that too, because
I feel like you're really detracting from this conversation right now, Jason.
All right, I'll go. I'll leave the room.
No, look, in some ways I do actually think, in lots of places people would admit, the two biggest religions here are, Christianity and football is more important. It does have the elements of that religious, you've got to wear the right jersey, you've got your prophets and your saints, and you've got your heretics who are the other team and all that sort of
rituals.
Stuff. Yeah. But one of the interesting things, I think, with that spirituality, with those three things, the way you seek the meaning, the way you experience it, and the way you express it, when you look at the way we think about what morality is as well, it's and Brett Litz, who's one of the guys who was one of the first people to really do moral injury work, he'll talk about it being, those social rules for behaviour, and it's your fundamental assumptions about how things should work, how the world should work. You go back to the 2-year-old who's had a cardiac arrest. The world shouldn't be like that. My assumptions are like that. And in that sense, spirituality, I think, has less to do with just meditation and mindfulness or going to church or going to the mosque or anything like that. It's got to do with the way we interact with our world. And a really switched on spiritual person is a kind person, is a gracious person who has been able to center themselves on who they are and what they believe, and they're going to work for good in the world. And spirituality is something that I think we all are. And we all have an element to us where we find our sense of deeper meaning. And there's lots of atheist writers now writing about it as well. So Sam Harris wrote a few years ago about trying to find spirituality without religion. Having said that, spirituality and religion do overlap. A large part of my spiritual identity has to do with my religious expression as well. But I want that to be me doing good in the world, not me just assenting to a whole bunch of lines of a creed or something like that, to be able to go, the way I act in the world is a much bigger proof of my spiritual richness than whether or not I assent to lines on a creed. And I think we all have that. And so many first responders in my context, they come in with a real desire to do something good, to do something positive in the world. But at the point at which they join and which they're acting on this impulse to do something good, they never get the opportunity to really sit with what it is that they believe and where they go, and then how they can maintain that, not let the acid of trauma and betrayal lead them down a bad path, but how I can keep coming back and revisiting who I am, what I stand for, and keep being that. And sometimes there'd be the recognition that actually to be this, I can't work in this organisation anymore. And that's possibly a point. But or to go to work in this organisation, I'm going to keep doing the things that I do, and I'll perhaps draw a line around it. So I encourage some people, if it's about doing good and you think you're limited in the good you can do within this organisation, find another outlet for it, and join a group within the community in which you can do your good deeds as well. Do the things you've got to do here, be the great clinician, the great police officer, the great firefighter, but draw a line around it and be able to do your good there so that you don't get changed and destroyed and give away that which you treasure so much to someone who has betrayed you for nothing. Don't give it away.
Yeah, like you say, you can be paid enough to give away like the essence of yourself, right? So, that's why we should also be thinking very carefully about who employs us and who we choose to give our time, our valuable time to.
So thinking about moral injury outside of first responders or the military, in terms of a workplace context, what do you think is the way ahead for organisations?
Yeah, I think firstly, the step is to recognise its existence, and that it's a concept that relies on this sense of betrayal. And the military and emergency services, it's really important, but it actually happens within these organisations, and understand what it is. There's some people working out of ANU who have started to do some good work using some of these scales on moral injury and going, well, actually, we are seeing this in civilian populations, and to understand what it looks like and how it might be caused in an organisation. And I think perhaps we need a better taxonomy, if you will, of what moral injury is. And I'm starting to call it moral injuries because I think it's a dimensional thing. There's perhaps a little bit different from committing deliberately or overtly committing a war crime where you kill someone to I witnessed my co-worker not get the promotion they deserve. Now, they both carry a certain gravitas to it. And so perhaps finding a dimensional model is going to be really important to us. But examining those things, and what I think moral injury does for this psychosocial risk stuff is actually puts a human gravitas to what's going on. We say bullying. Okay, someone's mean to me that is a complete stranger, but actually we've got a social contract and a relationship here where I do this work for you and you pay me, but I also offer you loyalty and you offer me justice, not just a paycheck, and that we've got a social contract going on here And when you act outside of that, even if it's a subjective one, then you've got to deal with that. And so I think this moral injury has got lots to say into this psychosocial risk space on the gravitas that's involved with bullying and overwork and lack of communication and no recognition and all those different things. So I think it needs to be incorporated within it, and a better understanding of what it looks like in those different places, and then trying to change the things that we actually do, because I don't think it just sits in these situations like emergency services, this high risk thing. I think we all have high risk work. You know, we go to our employer to give us things so that we can feed and clothe our children and our loved ones, and so that we can eat and do all those kind of things. It's very high risk if we lose our job and that connection, and that's for, you know, it actually has significant high risk stuff for the way that we live and experience our world. So I think understanding it, getting a better taxonomy of it, and then trying to address the specific things within cultures and practices of organisations more generally.
So, Mark, one of the questions that we ask all of the guests on the podcast is, given that you work in the world of workplace mental health, and you have been doing for some time, and obviously you're going to be continuing that. Hopefully you just don't do a PhD and quit, but you continue on that great journey. What are your hopes for the future of workplace mental health?
Well, I hope it gets better. I think it's so important that it's actually being addressed, you know, not just doing trip hazards, but actually looking at that organisations themselves can cause harm, and not just mitigating outward things, but seeing where we can do it, you know. And I hope that we get within our settings. As I was thinking about this, you know, 3 words came up that I hope get incorporated, you know, wisdom. Wisdom is not just knowing what the right thing is, it's doing the right thing. The old saying that it's knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, and wisdom is not putting it in a fruit salad. Knowledge is knowing the right thing to say. Wisdom is knowing whether or not how to say it. And there are things within our settings that I think this can help us with. I hope it's gracious as well, where we actually see the relational settings that go on with our workplace. And I both like and dislike that idea of a work-life balance, as if I live life and then work as a completely separate entity that doesn't actually exist as part of my life. But then the juxtaposition where we now get so much more value and worth out of our work. We don't want to just pay the bills. We want to do something that's worthwhile and that is meaningful. And so I hope we can bring those settings of personal relationships into our workplace and be gracious with each other, you know, and forgiving and reconciling where we can. And like, I think the last word, which we never really talk about in this, is loving. My concept of loving is actually doing good for the other person. And when you look at that setting, you know, from military officers I talked about before that have been through the crucible, they love their comrades, the ones that they fought alongside, and they'll do anything for them. If you worked in a place where people were wise, gracious, and loving, you might go, hey, that's a really good part of my life, and extend those settings. That's where I hope on a meta kind of level we get to.
Yeah, people love 3 bullet points, right? Particularly for ministers. So wisdom, graciousness, and love. I think they're really great ambitions for workplace mental health for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess speaking from a very different professional background to probably the majority of the guests that we've had on, what words of advice would you have for listeners who want to work in the field of psych health and safety?
Yeah, I think do it. I think it's sadly a growth industry. I think as we move into a less industrialized society where the physical injuries are going to be a lower proportion of what's going on in the work health and safety space, it really needs people who are switched on, who can exhibit those kind of character traits as well, and don't just get knowledge, get wisdom, and work and play well with other kids. Sometimes we get a really siloed approach. we get a siloed approach where we have our work health and safety people in this department, we have our staff wellbeing in the next corridor, but we really are kind of competing against them for resources. And then even within the wellbeing space, you have the different professionals actually competing against each other rather than working alongside each other. And work out how to use, I think, interdisciplinary methods. In our space, when it works well, we have psychologists and chaplains and peer supporters and health coaches all working together for a goal together. And I think there's lots of questions it brings up, but yeah, work and play well with other kids from different settings and use the skills that you acquire to the utmost of your ability to do it, because we need people who are really switched on and who are really caring for the people that they are working with and for.
Yeah, collaboration is one of the key messages that that keeps coming through in this space. That it really does take that that multidisciplinary approach to be able to do it properly. So that's a really important message.
Well, Mark, it's been a fascinating discussion, definitely a completely new topic that we have not covered yet in almost 80 episodes of the show. So thank you so much for coming along and sharing from your tremendous amount of experience.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm really enjoying catching up on your podcast. I've been a late comer to them, but I'm really, really enjoying them. So more power to you guys, and thanks for having me on.
No, thanks, Mark. We'll have to get you when you finish up your PhD, and you can let us know all about how it went.
Yeah, absolutely. Love to.
Yeah, amazing. All right. Well, thanks, Mark, again. And that brings us to the end of the show, listeners. So don't forget, we do video these when we record with our guests. So you'll be able to catch that on the Flourish GX YouTube channel if you like. We'll also be pulling out some of the best clips out of this talk with Mark today and putting it on the Flourish GX LinkedIn page. So follow along there if you want to see some highlights from all of our shows. Joel and I are very active on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out to us as well. We won't bite. And that is it. So we will catch you next episode.